Interlude 1. Lucy. She was growing used to her new world, and that scared her more than anything had so far in her life. She was used to fear, and uncertainty, and abuse, and hunger. She wasn't used to feeling useful, and that was what was scaring her. Of course, there was plenty to hate in this new world. The work, for one thing. The guards forced everyone to work, even when the jobs didn't make sense, and sometimes even when they were obviously pointless. Lucy realised that it wasn't the work that mattered, just that they were all forced to do it. It showed Lucy and the others that their place in this new world was one of slaves. That Lucy could understand. Her life before this had been bad enough. This was hardly much worse, if you didn't count the change. Of course, how could you not count the change? That was what had brought them here, to this new world of theirs. It was different from the old world physically, but not much else had altered. She was still an orphan, still unprotected, still forced to live on the edge of death constantly. But now she had responsibilities too. The guards had made that much clear. She'd been the first, and she was the oldest here. It was her duty to teach the newcomers, to help them to adjust to the change, to stop them killing themselves in despair, and to see that they worked. If they didn't work, the guards would rough them up. And if they caused too many problems, like Tim had done, then the guards killed, and they forced the others to watch. Lucy still had nightmares, still hearing Tim's screams, seeing the blood fountaining from his body as the guards tore him apart. That had been horrifying, but what was worse was that the guards had enjoyed it. They had been longing for someone else to give them the excuse to kill again. So far, Lucy had made certain that it had never occurred. The day's work was done, and the guards prodded them all back into the dormitory for the night. They had all eaten, and there had been many days in her old life when Lucy had gone to bed feeling hunger eating at her insides. At least here they all ate, even if it was a monotonous diet. Her muscles ached from working, but she felt fairly good otherwise. It was nice to go to bed with a full stomach. "Come along, everyone," she called to the younger ones. "It's time for bed now." "Tell us a story," begged Vicky. She was the youngest here, only about 8. There were 20 of them now since Joshua had arrived 2 days ago. He still hurt from the change, Lucy knew, and he was having troubles adjusting to his new life. "Yes," Joshua agreed. "Tell us a story." Lucy hesitated. It would help him and the others if she could take their minds off their states. "I don't know any," she confessed miserably. "I never learned to read, and my folks died when I was too young to be told any." "You know one story," Vicky objected. "You know your own." Lucy smiled. "But you've heard that one dozens of times already," she objected. "You must know it by heart." "Joshua doesn't," Lizzie pointed out. "He's new. He'd like to hear it. You tell it so well." "Yes," agreed Joshua eagerly. "I want to hear it." Lucy shook her head and laughed, a clear, tinkling laugh of pure happiness. "Oh, very well," she agreed. As they gathered around her, she looked out at their expectant faces. "Well, every good story starts with once upon a time. Once upon a time, I lived in a nightmare. I don't remember my parents at all. When I grew up, I lived with an old man called Cherry. He was gruff and sometimes mean, but usually only when he got drunk. He didn't have much money, so he couldn't get drunk too often. When he did, I tried to hide away until he passed out. If I couldn't, he'd hit me and knock me around the little hut that we lived in. He told me once that my father had been a sailor drowned at sea, and that my mother had died of grief, leaving me an unwanted orphan. He had taken me in because he had been related to my mother, and it was only out of the kindness of his heart. I didn't know he had any kindness, because he never showed it to me. As soon as I could walk, he took me out onto the beaches and rocks. There he showed me how to scavenge for things brought in by the tide, pieces of wood mostly. He had a big knife that he used to carve the wood into all sorts of shapes. Some of them I knew, like boats and things. Some of them I'd never seen, seals, for example. He used to be a whaler, he told me, and had often seen seals. He had gone off on a ship to a land of ice where night had never come. I laughed once when he told me this, thinking he was making it up. That made him mad, and he hit me and swore it was all true. It was funny, really. He didn't have much goodness inside of him, but he could really carve the wood into beautiful shapes. Then he'd take them into town once a week or so and sell them. With the money, he'd get good and drunk, so I soon learned to hide away until he got over it. He felt sorry for himself because he couldn't go back on the ships and off to hunt the whales and seals, you see. On his last trip, his foot had been hurt, and he'd lost it. Instead of a real foot, he had a long piece of wood that he'd stomp about on. It made him slow, so I could dodge out of his way if I was lucky. It hurt him to move about on this wooden foot, so I soon found out that the real reason he'd taken me in had nothing to do with him taking pity on me, or me being a relative of his. I think he just lied about that part. I was there to do all the things he couldn't manage, like getting the wood from the rocks for his carvings, or getting food from town if he had any money left after his drinking. Usually I had to steal the food, or take it from the farmers' fields. That was scary, because some of the farmers would have killed me if they'd caught me. I got to be pretty good at hiding, what with the farmers and Old Man Cherry. But I wasn't good enough when it mattered. Sometimes, if a ship was wrecked at sea, I'd find other things on the rocks when the tide washed them in. I found a whole box filled with eating things once. Not food, the stuff you eat food with, knives and forks and spoons. Cherry was very pleased with that find, because the things were made out of silver, which he told me was worth a lot of money. He got really drunk 3 times after he sold those things. Once I found some books, but they were all soggy and you couldn't read them because they'd been ruined by the water. I didn't much care, since I can't read anyway, but it might have been nice just to look at the pictures. I found all sorts of stuff, and Cherry would sell them and then get drunk. I was about 10 when he died, and everything changed. That was almost 2 years ago. He'd been getting worse and worse all the time with his temper and everything, and I was growing up and getting stronger and different. He started to look at me all funny, and sometimes instead of yelling and throwing things at me, he'd make me come over to him and he'd touch me. It was horrible, and I'm not going to tell you those bits because it would scare you and disgust you. He was a horrible old man, and I hated him more and more every day that passed. Sometimes I'd go to bed at night and pray that God would kill him. I wanted the sky to open up and a thunderbolt to come down and burn Cherry up. In the end he did die, but it wasn't a thunderbolt that killed him. It was his own knife. He'd had one of his good selling days in town again, and had gone to get drunk. I knew what that would mean when he got back. He'd either hit me or touch me, and I wasn't about to stand for either. I knew that when he went off drinking, it would be hours and hours he'd be gone, until either the pubs would close, or they'd throw him out, or he'd run out of money. Well, I knew he had lots of money, because I'd found a box on the beach that had sailor stuff in, metal instruments that could see far away and things like that. He'd sold them for a lot of money, so he was bound to get good and drunk. I made up in my mind that when he came back, he wouldn't have me there for him any more. I didn't have any things of my own, except for a few tattered old clothes he'd bought me from time to time, so I didn't need to pack much, and I had a few coins I'd managed to find around, or steal when he'd been too drunk to notice. I'd planned all this for a long time, you see, till I got enough courage to try it. Of course, despite all my planning, things went terribly wrong. I had expected Cherry to spend the whole evening at the pub, but he had met two men there, and they had started talking. The men had persuaded him to buy drinks to bring home with him so they could all get drunk together. So when I slipped out of the cabin door, instead of being able to escape in the night, I ran right into the three of them as they arrived. Cherry was slightly drunk, but he wasn't stupid. He could see what I was up to, and he was furious, of course. If there had just been him, I could have escaped, because he couldn't move as quickly as I could with his wooden leg. There was nothing wrong with his companions. One of them, a rat-faced man they called Raintree, grabbed me before I could run. The other man was tall and almost all muscle, named Brogan. You've all met the two of them, since they brought us all here, but they had just begun their work at this point and were celebrating with Cherry. They were all a little drunk, and that made them even nastier than normal. Raintree held me too tightly for me to break free, with his thin arm around my throat. He and Brogan encouraged Cherry as the old man ranted and raged about how ungrateful I was, and how evil I was, and how terrible I was to leave him alone in his old age to die. Raintree kept slipping his sly little comments in, working Cherry up. He wanted to see me hurt. It wasn't that he disliked me any more than he disliked the rest of the world, but he enjoyed seeing people hurt. Finally, Cherry drew that carving knife of his. "I've carved many things with this," he told me, waving it drunkenly under my face. "You won't be the first person either, and I'll be very artistic with it. I'll cut you so that you won't die. You'll just wish you would. When people look at you from now on, they'll shudder at what they see, and they'll know better than to ever cross Cherry again." I knew he meant it to. He was going to use his knife to give me dreadful pain, and then to leave scars all over me so I'd be hideous and repulsive. He knew I couldn't get away, and Raintree and Brogan were laughing and crying aloud to see me hurt. I was terribly afraid, because I knew he'd make me suffer. But Raintree was so intent on what was promising to be his idea of sport that he wasn't as careful as he should have been. The terrible choking grip he had on me loosened just enough. I could take several gasping breaths, and I knew I had only one chance. I bit his arm as hard as I could. He screamed, and his grip faltered again. Spitting out his vile blood, I pulled myself free. At that second, Cherry lunged at me with his knife. I didn't have any choice but to dive forward to try and escape him. Cherry collided with Raintree instead of cutting me, and his knife sliced Raintree's hurt arm even more. I rolled out of the way and staggered to my feet. As I was about to flee, I looked back. With a roar of pain and rage, Raintree lashed out at Cherry. Unsteady on his feet because of the drink in his wooden leg, the old man fell down. Raintree grabbed the carving knife from Cherry's hands and plunged it down into the fallen man's stomach. Cherry gave a horrible scream and twisted. He died slowly. I couldn't move. I was so terrified and sickened. Then I felt Brogan's huge hand grab my arm, and I was a captive again. I couldn't escape his strong grip, and he dragged me back to where Raintree was getting back to his feet and staring down at the screaming, dying old man. I was horrified, but I couldn't feel any pity for Cherry. I was glad he'd finally met the end he deserved. He couldn't beat me or touch me ever again, but I was still in a great deal of trouble. "You've killed him," Brogan told his ratty friend. "Now what do we do?" Raintree looked at me with his little evil eyes. I knew that he wanted to kill me, so there wouldn't be any witnesses. But I was lucky, because greed was stronger in him than his love for blood. "We get away from here," he said, "and she comes with us." Brogan stared at me. He wasn't very bright and he didn't understand. "Why don't I just break her neck?" he asked. "That way nobody will know anything." "Idiot," Raintree said. "We're being paid to get children for the doctor, aren't we? And isn't she a child?" "Oh, I get it," Brogan said. "Once she's been changed, she won't be able to tell anyone, will she?" "Right," agreed Raintree. "And if she dies, then we didn't kill her, did we?" As you can imagine, I didn't have a clue about what they meant. All I knew was that Cherry was rattling his way to death, blood and stuff spilling out of his stomach, and that I was free of him. Raintree and Brogan had something in mind for me that was probably horrible and scary, but I didn't much care right then. I was free of Cherry at last. Lucy stopped her story and smiled at the younger ones about her. "That's enough for one time," she told them. There was a chorus of moans. "You can't stop there," complained Joshua. "What happened next?" "I'll tell you the rest after work tomorrow," promised Lucy. She ignored the complaints. "If we talk too long, the guards get angry," she explained. "So we'd better get our rest. We'll have a lot of work to do tomorrow, you know. They always make sure of that." With the odd grumble, the children began settling down for the night. Lucy checked on them, making sure they were comfortable. She left Joshua for last. He smiled up at her. "You're very brave," he told her admiringly. "We all are," she answered. "We have to be. You're one of us now. I'm sorry you were chosen. You are welcome as part of our family. We have to look after each other because nobody else will look out for us." Joshua nodded and gripped her hand tightly. "You'll be here for us," he said. "I trust you." "Good night," she replied. Then she gently pulled her hand free. As he settled down, she crossed to her own sleeping area. She knew that the other children were drawing on her strength to survive the change with their minds intact. If only she was as certain that she could hold up under stress as they seemed to be. But she had to go on, despite everything, for their sake. They needed her so much. She couldn't let them down.